Every woman in that ballroom had dressed herself in hope that evening, silk pressed, pearls fastened, smiles rehearsed until they felt genuine. The most beautiful among them stood at the center, golden and certain, fully prepared to be chosen. The Duke arrived, scanned the room, looked directly at her, and then kept looking. Past her. All the way to the shadowed corner where a girl in a quiet violet dress sat reading a book and wanting absolutely nothing from anyone in that room. He could not explain it. He did not try. He simply walked toward her, and in doing so, walked away from everything the room had decided his life was supposed to be. Hello, my golden-hearted wanderer. As the sun dips low, painting the sky in hues of buried treasure, pause and whisper to me, where does your evening light fade tonight? From the bustling pulse of Lagos markets, the storied whispers of Virginia's old estates, the fog-kissed peaks of Scotland, or under starlit expanses in Australia, Texas, or Toronto. Drop it in the comments below. I cherish every word, turning our tales into a tapestry woven by you. If these slow-burn romances of veiled passions and golden longings stir your soul, hit that like, subscribe to Hearts Buried in Gold, and let's unearth more together. Now, lean close. She had not come to the ballroom to be found. That is the part the room never understood about Lydia Sontion. Her corner was not a waiting place. It was not the spot where the overlooked girls sat nursing quiet wounds, stealing glances at the dancing couples, counting the minutes until someone noticed her and rescued her from the edges of her own life. It was a decision. A deliberate, considered, 4-seasons-running decision to opt out of a game she had never asked to play and had no interest in losing gracefully. She brought a book. She always brought a book. Not as decoration, not as a prop designed to look interestingly intellectual, but as a genuine, functioning wall between herself and the performance of a room that had decided, long before she arrived, that she was not the evening's main event. The book said, I am already somewhere else. The violet dress said, I am not competing. The corner said, do not fetch me back. It had worked without exception for 4 straight years, through dozens of balls, countless dinners, and more evenings of watching her sister Celeste ignite every room she entered while Lydia quietly tended the small, private fire of a life lived entirely on her own terms. Until the night the Duke of Ashford walked in, swept his gaze across a ballroom full of women who wanted everything from him, and stopped, without explanation, without warning, without any regard whatsoever for the careful system she had spent for years building, at her. The Duke of Ashford did not make an entrance so much as he made a reckoning. He appeared in the doorway at 8:30 without announcement, without the theatrical pause some men of his station employed to let a room catch up to their arrival, and yet the room caught up anyway, the way it always did, the way it always would, because power does not require performance. It simply requires presence. And Richard Morris had presence the way a storm has presence. You felt it before you saw it, and by the time you saw it, it had already changed the atmosphere entirely. The crowd shifted. Conversations dissolved mid-sentence. Fans that had been moving with the lazy rhythm of a warm evening stilled in gloved hands. Every head turned with the slow, helpless unanimity of a field of flowers orienting toward the sun, and at the center of it all, as though she had been placed there by careful arrangement, stood Celeste. She was extraordinary tonight. Even Lydia, from her quiet corner, could see that clearly and without bitterness. The golden gown caught every flicker of candlelight in the room and returned it tenfold, so that Celeste did not merely stand in the light but seemed to produce it, seemed to be its source, its reason, its most persuasive argument. Her pearls gleamed at her throat. Her chin was lifted at precisely the right angle. Her smile, warm and unhurried, carried the particular confidence of a woman who has never once looked into a room and failed to find her place in it. The room had made its choice on the Duke's behalf. The room had done everything short of placing a sign. Richard's gaze found Celeste immediately. It would have been physically difficult not to, and moved across her face with the quiet, assessing attention of a man examining something he has been told is remarkable and is now conducting his own investigation. He looked at her the way you look at a painting that everyone has agreed is a masterpiece, carefully, respectfully, and with the growing, privately troubling suspicion that you are not feeling what you are supposed to feel. A moment passed. Then his gaze moved. It traveled with slow, almost involuntary deliberateness, past Celeste, past the cluster of admiring faces surrounding her, past the warm gold center of the room and all its noise and intention, until it reached the place where the chandelier light finally exhausted itself and gave way to shadow. And there it stopped. Lydia felt nothing. She was on page 49 of a novel she had been trying to finish for 2 weeks, and the scene was just arriving at something interesting, and she had absolutely no awareness of the fact that across the full width of a crowded ballroom, a man who had just looked past the most admired woman in the room had found her face in the dark and gone very, very still. She turned the page. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves when he has made a decision and would prefer not to examine it too closely before he acts on it, with calm, forward momentum and the carefully maintained expression of someone doing something entirely ordinary. Nobody stopped him. Nobody dared. You did not intercept the Duke of Ashford mid-stride to make small talk about the weather or your daughter's accomplishments. You watched him pass and you wondered where he was going, and then, when the direction became unmistakable, you wondered if you had misread it, because surely, he was not walking to the corner. Surely he was not bypassing Celeste Sontillon, golden and waiting under the best chandelier in the room, to cross the entire length of a ballroom and approach a girl sitting alone in the dark with a book. And yet, he stopped directly in front of her. Close enough that his shadow fell across her page before his voice did. Lydia looked up. For one unguarded moment, the only moment she would later be unable to fully account for, she simply stared. He was taller than she had registered from across the room. Darker. And he was looking at her with that expression she still did not have a clean word for, the one that sat somewhere between recognition and question, as though she were a sentence he had encountered before in a different book and could not yet place. He spoke first. "That is not light reading," he said, nodding toward the volume in her hands. His voice was even, unhurried, carrying no trace of the performative charm most men of his rank deployed in opening conversations with women they wished to impress. He simply said the thing he was thinking. It was so unexpected that for a moment she forgot to be guarded. She looked down at the book. Looked back up at him. No, she agreed. It isn't. Most people find that a sufficient reason to avoid it. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the immediate predecessor to one. The expression of a man who has asked what he believed was a simple question and received instead an answer that has genuinely surprised him. "And you," he said. "Do you find it sufficient?" "I find it convenient," Lydia said, with the calm honesty of a woman who has long since stopped packaging her thoughts for easier consumption. A difficult book discourages interruption. Until this evening it has been entirely reliable. The not-quite smile became something more definite. He did not leave. He did not bristle or retreat into the stiff formality that men of his position typically employed when a woman failed to perform the expected script of flattery and deference. He stood there in the shadow of her corner, this man the entire room was waiting for, and looked at her as though she had just said the most interesting thing he had heard all season. Which, though Lydia did not know it yet, was precisely the truth. She did not sleep. She had expected to. Sleep had always come easily to Lydia, one of the quiet rewards of a life lived without the particular exhaustion of wanting things. You closed your eyes, you left the day behind, and the night asked nothing of you. It was an arrangement she had relied upon for years without once thinking to be grateful for it. But the night after the Ashford ball, she lay in the dark of her bedroom with her eyes open and her mind doing something she had specifically, deliberately, architecturally designed her entire existence to prevent it from doing. It was hoping. Not loudly. Not with the breathless, dramatic urgency of a woman spinning fantasies in the dark. It was quieter and therefore more dangerous than that, a small, persistent warmth that had taken up residence somewhere behind her sternum without her permission and was refusing, with extraordinary stubbornness, to be reasoned away. She tried. She was good at reason. She marshaled her arguments in the dark with the methodical focus of a woman who had written 3 margins full of philosophical annotations and meant every word of them. He was a duke. She was the overlooked sister. He had spoken to her for perhaps 12 minutes at a crowded ball where he had social obligations to fulfill and any number of reasons to approach a woman sitting alone, none of which required him to find her remotely interesting. He had smiled, or nearly smiled, and said a handful of sentences, and she was lying awake at 2 in the morning treating it like evidence of something. It was not evidence of anything. She was being foolish. She was being precisely the kind of foolish she had spent for years engineering herself not to be. The warmth behind her sternum remained entirely unmoved by this assessment. By 4 o'clock she had given up entirely on sleep and was dressed before the household stirred. She moved through the quiet corridors of the estate with her book under her arm and the particular purposefulness of a woman fleeing something she would not name, out through the side door and into the gardens where the morning was still grey and cool and blessedly, completely empty of people who might look at her face and see something she was not ready to have seen. The garden at dawn was her oldest refuge. It asked nothing of her. The roses did not care about the season's social mathematics. The gravel path did not require her to be charming or invisible or anything other than a person walking along it with a book and a troubled mind and the fresh, unhelpful memory of dark eyes finding her face across a crowded room and staying there far longer than logic could comfortably explain. She found her bench beneath the elm tree. Saturday. She opened the book to page 49, the same page she had been on all evening, she noticed, and stared at the words without reading a single one. The morning birds began, indifferent and cheerful, overhead. Lydia turned a page she had not read and told herself, firmly, that this meant nothing at all. She heard the footsteps on the gravel before she saw him. They were unhurried footsteps, not the brisk, purposeful stride of a man with somewhere to be, but the slower, more deliberate pace of someone who had somewhere to escape from. Lydia kept her eyes on her page with the focused discipline of a woman who had decided, somewhere between the elm tree and the 3rd unread paragraph, that whatever the morning chose to send in her direction she would meet it with absolute composure. Then the footsteps stopped. Directly beside her bench. She looked up. Richard Morris stood at the edge of the path in the grey morning light, his coat slightly undone in a way that suggested he had dressed without assistance and without particular care, his dark hair carrying the faint disorder of a man who had also, she noted with a complicated internal stillness, not slept well. He looked different out here. Reduced, somehow, in the most unexpectedly compelling way, stripped of the ballroom and the candlelight and the enormous social machinery that followed his name everywhere it went. He looked, standing in the misty garden at dawn with no audience and no occasion to perform for, almost like an ordinary person. Almost. "You are avoiding the house," he said. It was not a question. "I am reading," Lydia replied, with the precise tone of a woman making a meaningful distinction. "In the garden. Before 5 in the morning. The light is adequate." He looked at the grey, bare-arisen sky with an expression of mild skepticism, and then, without invitation, without the formal request that etiquette required and that she would almost certainly have declined, he sat down on the far end of her bench, leaving a careful and appropriate distance between them, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked out at the misted garden with the expression of a man setting down something very heavy. When he spoke, there was no preamble. No careful social architecture. Just the plain, slightly worn voice of someone who had decided, perhaps because the hour was too early for pretense or perhaps because something about her specifically made pretense feel beside the point, to simply say the true thing. "I have attended 31 events this season," he said quietly. 31 rooms full of people who look at me and see a title, an estate, a set of obligations dressed in a coat. They laugh at things I say that are not funny because I said them. They agree with opinions I do not hold because I appear to hold them. They perform their most carefully constructed cells for my inspection and then wonder why I cannot find in any of them a single person I actually wish to speak to. He paused. Until last night. Lydia said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. It was one of her most reliable defenses. You told me my presence was an interruption, he said, and there was something in his voice now that was almost, quietly, like wonder. Nobody has said an honest thing to me in so long that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to hear one. Vichy looked at him then, really looked, the way she had been carefully avoiding doing since he sat down, and found him already looking back at her with an open, unguarded expression that a man of his position had absolutely no business wearing in the company of a woman he had spoken to only once. It frightened her. Not because it was unwelcome, but because it was not. I did not say it to be interesting, she said carefully. I said it because it was true. I know, Richard said. That is exactly what I mean. He came back the next morning. Lydia told herself she had not expected it. She told herself this with some conviction while she was dressing, and with slightly less conviction while she was walking to the garden, and with almost none at all by the time she reached the elm tree and found herself noting, before she sat down, that the bench was still empty and the gravel path was still quiet, and she had approximately 4 minutes before she would know whether the previous morning had been an accident or a pattern. It was not an accident. He appeared from the direction of the east gate at the same unhurried pace as before, same slight disorder to his coat, same expression of a man who had left something suffocating behind him in the house and was only now, out here in the cool and the quiet, beginning to breathe at a natural rate. He sat at the far end of the bench without ceremony. Lydia kept her book open on principle. They had settled, without discussing it, into something that had no proper name in the social vocabulary she had been raised with. It was not a courtship. Courtships had rules and witnesses and the loud, performative involvement of mothers. It was not a friendship, exactly, though it carried friendship's ease. It was simply two people who had independently concluded that the morning garden was preferable to the house, and who had discovered, with equal parts relief and unease, that the other person's company did not diminish that preference. It was on this third morning that he told her about his uncle. Arthur Morris, he explained, with the measured tone of a man describing a weather system he has learned to navigate rather than resist, was the architect of Richard's entire social calendar. Pragmatic, unsentimental, and possessed of the specific ruthlessness that passes in certain families for love. Arthur had compiled, over the course of the season, what Richard referred to without particular warmth as the blueprint, a considered assessment of every eligible woman in their social circle, ranked by family standing, financial position, and what his uncle called architectural suitability, by which he meant the quality of fitting, without alteration or complication, into the life a Duke of Ashford was expected to lead. Celeste Sontillon, Richard said quietly, was at the top of that list. Lydia received this information with the stillness of a woman who had always known it and had simply not expected to hear it stated plainly while sitting 4 feet away from the man it concerned. She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the middle distance and reminded herself that this was not news, that she had never allowed herself to build anything that could be damaged by it, that she was sensible and clear-eyed and entirely, completely fine. She fits every measurement, Richard continued. The family name. The manner. The appearance. My uncle could not have designed a more suitable candidate if he had constructed one deliberately. He paused for a long moment, turning his gloves over in his hands with the restless focus of a man choosing his next words carefully. She is everything the blueprint requires. The garden was very quiet. And yet, Lydia said, because the sentence was clearly unfinished and she was, despite her best efforts, unable to leave it hanging in the morning air indefinitely. He looked at her with an expression of such direct, undefended honesty that it cost her something to hold his gaze. And yet she does not make me want a life, he said simply. She makes me want to fulfill one. There is a difference, Lydia, between a life you have built and a life you have merely completed, and I have spent enough mornings in this garden now to know, with a certainty I cannot argue myself out of, which of those two things I am sitting next to. The elm tree stood above them, indifferent and patient. Lydia looked down at her book. At the same page she had been failing to read for 4 consecutive mornings, and felt, with quiet and terrifying clarity, the 4-season-old architecture of wanting nothing begin, brick by careful brick, to come apart. Eleanor Sontion noticed everything. This was not a gift she had cultivated so much as a survival skill she had refined over 30 years of navigating a society that rewarded the observant and destroyed the oblivious. She noticed the precise angle of a man's attention across a dinner table. She noticed which invitations arrived first and which arrived as afterthoughts. She noticed the difference between a compliment offered freely and a compliment offered to fill silence, and she had built an entire family's social standing on the intelligence gathered from exactly these distinctions. She noticed, on the 4th morning after the Ashford ball, that the Duke had not yet called on Celeste. She said nothing about this at breakfast. Eleanor Sontion did not say things at breakfast. She filed them, catalogued them, and retrieved them later at the precise moment they would be most useful. She poured her tea and smiled at Celeste across the table and commented on the weather with the serene composure of a woman who was, beneath the composure, conducting a thorough and rather urgent audit of the situation. Lydia ate her toast and did not look up. This was the new geometry of her days, a careful, exhausting navigation between two realities that could not be permitted to touch each other. By day she was exactly what she had always been, the quiet sister, the unobtrusive presence at the edge of every room, the girl with the book and the violet dress and no observable interest in anything that was currently making her mother's left eye develop a faint, almost imperceptible twitch. She attended the drawing room sessions. She sat through the afternoon calls. She listened to Celeste practice her responses to hypothetical ducal conversation topics with the patient, affectionate attention of a woman who was not, absolutely not, thinking about a garden bench and a man turning his gloves over in his hands and saying the word life as though he meant something specific by it. By night she lay awake and thought about all of it. The corridor outside her bedroom had developed, over the past week, a new and unwelcome acoustic quality, or perhaps she had simply become more attuned to it. She heard her mother's footsteps at odd hours, the particular brisk cadence of a woman on a reconnaissance mission she had not announced. She heard Celeste's door, the low murmur of a conversation she was not invited to. She heard the household rearranging itself around an expectation that had not yet been confirmed and was therefore, in Eleanor Sontion's strategic vocabulary, a problem requiring active management. On the 5th day, her mother found her in the library. She did not sit down. Eleanor rarely sat when she was delivering what she considered to be important information. She found that standing lent her words a useful gravity. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning but occupied the precise, uncomfortable territory between the two. "The Duke is expected at the Harwell dinner on Thursday," she said, in the tone of a woman discussing something entirely routine. "Celeste will wear the ivory. I thought you might consider something other than violet for once." Lydia looked up from her book. "I am comfortable in violet," she said. "Comfort," her mother replied, with the clipped precision of a woman filing a dissent, "is not the objective of a Thursday dinner." She left without waiting for a response. Eleanor Sontion rarely waited for responses. Responses were variables she preferred not to introduce into conversation she had already resolved. Lydia sat very still in the library after she had gone, listening to the retreating footsteps in the corridor, and understood with a cold and clarifying certainty that the walls between her two realities, the visible life and the private one, the invisible sister and the woman on the garden bench, were thinner than she had allowed herself to believe. Her mother was watching. Her mother was always watching. And Eleanor Sontion, who had noticed everything for 30 years, was beginning, with the slow and terrible accuracy of a woman who had built a family's future on her instincts, to notice something was wrong. The library felt smaller than it had that morning. Lydia opened her book, looked at the page without reading it, and thought about how much longer she could keep the two hanging. The Harwell Ball was the event of the season, and everyone knew it. Not because Lord Harwell was particularly distinguished or his ballroom particularly remarkable, but because the Harwell Ball was the evening on which things were decided. Courtships that had been hovering in polite ambiguity all season resolved themselves here, under the weight of expectation and the particular social pressure of a room that had been watching and waiting and was no longer willing to be patient about it. Offers were anticipated. Dances were tallied. The opening set was not merely a dance, it was a declaration, a public statement delivered in waltz time to an audience that would be discussing it over breakfast the following morning. Eleanor Sontion had understood this for 30 years. She had arrived early, positioned her family with the strategic precision of a general who had studied the terrain in advance, and placed Celeste directly beneath the main chandelier with the satisfied expression of a woman setting a table she fully expected to be sat at. Celeste wore ivory, as instructed, a gown so perfectly chosen that it managed to be both modest and extraordinary, which was exactly the calibration her mother had requested. Her hair was dressed with small pearl pins. Her posture was flawless. She stood in the light as though the light had specifically requested her presence, and she was, by any honest measure, the most beautiful woman in the room. She was also, in the way of a woman who has waited very gracefully for something she has been assured is coming, beginning to wait. The Duke arrived at 9. The room did what rooms always did, it caught itself, rearranged, oriented. Lydia, standing at the edge of the assembled guests in a gown her mother had selected and she had put on without argument, felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere and kept her eyes directed at a point on the far wall with the focused neutrality of a woman dismantling hope one deliberate breath at a time. She had decided, somewhere between the library and the carriage ride and the first sight of the chandelier blazing above Celeste's carefully arranged head, that tonight she would be sensible. Tonight she would be the invisible sister. Tonight she would honor the system that had kept her safe for 4 years and stop pretending that garden mornings were a foundation you could build something real upon. She had decided all of this very firmly. Richard entered the ballroom, and her eyes found him before she had finished deciding. He moved through the greetings with the composed efficiency of a man completing a necessary passage, nodding, inclining his head, exchanging the minimum number of words that courtesy required. She watched him work his way across the room toward the chandelier, toward Celeste, toward the moment the entire gathering had assembled to witness, and she made herself breathe at a normal rate and reminded herself that this was the correct and inevitable conclusion to a story she had never been a character in. He reached the edge of the chandelier's light. He looked at Celeste. Celeste smiled, warm, genuine, the smile of a woman welcoming something she has earned. The room leaned forward by half a degree, collectively and unconsciously, the way crowds lean when something they have been anticipating is finally about to happen. Richard looked at Celeste for a long, still moment. And then he turned. He turned with the calm, unhurried deliberateness of a man who has made a decision in full knowledge of its consequences and has resolved to meet those consequences without apology. His gaze crossed the room, passed through the assembled faces, traveled all the way to the edge of the light where a woman in an unremarkable gown stood very still against the wall, and locked. He walked toward her. The silence that fell was not total, the musicians continued, the candles continued, the room continued in its physical functions, but something underneath the noise went absolutely quiet. Heads turned. Fans stilled. Eleanor Sontion, standing 6 feet from her eldest daughter, went the particular shade of pale that precedes not tears but action. Lydia did not move. She was not entirely certain she was breathing. He stopped in front of her. The Duke of Ashford, in full view of every person who mattered in their social world, looked at the girl nobody had thought to want and lowered himself into a slow, deliberate, unambiguous bow. "Miss Sontion," he said, and held out his hand with the steady certainty of a man who had already, long before this moment, made his choice. "Will you dance?" The room held its breath. Lydia looked at his hand, looked at his face, found there the same open, unguarded expression he wore in the garden at dawn, the one that had no performance in it, no calculation, nothing but the plain and steady truth of a man asking for the one thing he actually wanted in a room full of things he had been told to want instead. She took his hand. And the room, which had been so certain it knew how this evening was going to end, discovered all at once that it had been wrong. The dance lasted for minutes and 30 seconds. Lydia knew this because she counted, not from anxiety, though anxiety was present, but from the particular focusing mechanism of a woman who understands that she is standing inside a moment that will be discussed, dissected, and distributed across every breakfast table in their social world before the morning post arrives, and who finds that counting is the only thing keeping her from understanding the full enormity of that fact before she is ready to. 1, 2, 3. For minutes and 30 seconds of Richard's hand at her waist and the room's eyes on her face and the music continuing with magnificent indifference to the scandal being quietly assembled around them on every side. He danced well. She had not expected to notice that. She noticed it anyway. When the set ended, he returned her to the edge of the room with the composed attentiveness of a man performing a completely ordinary social act, which it was not, and which every person within 40 feet understood it was not, and the crowd parted around them with the stunned, slightly breathless quality of people who have just witnessed something they cannot yet classify. Not scandal, not exactly, not yet. But the immediate predecessor to it. The held breath before the door opens. The door opened approximately 3 minutes later when Eleanor Sontion appeared at Richard's elbow. She did not raise her voice. Eleanor Sontion never raised her voice in public. It was one of her foundational principles, the belief that a woman who raises her voice in company has already lost the argument she is making. She smiled instead, with the precise, dangerous warmth of a woman conducting a demolition project in formal wear, and she said, in a tone pitched exactly low enough to exclude the nearest observers while remaining entirely legible to those she intended to reach, that she wondered if the Duke might spare a moment for a private word. It was not a question. The small salon off the main corridor held, within 5 minutes, for people, Eleanor, Richard, Lydia, who had been collected by her mother's hand on her arm with a grip that communicated volumes without squeezing hard enough to leave a mark, and Celeste, who had come quietly and stood near the window with the expression of a woman trying to determine whether what she was feeling was heartbreak or something more complicated and less comfortable than that. Eleanor closed the door. The smile left her face with the efficiency of a woman who no longer required it. "Your Grace," she began, and her voice carried the low, controlled energy of something that has been heated to a very high temperature and is being deliberately, effortfully contained. "I have dedicated the better part of this season to the reasonable and I believe entirely justified expectation that this family would be honored with a connection that reflects its standing. I have invested considerable. I intend to marry your daughter," Richard said. Eleanor stopped. The room stopped. Lydia stopped, specifically, the careful, controlled breathing she had been maintaining since the dance ended stopped completely, replaced by a stillness so absolute it was almost loud. Eleanor recovered first, because Eleanor always recovered first. "Celeste," she began. "Lydia," Richard said. Quietly. Without qualification, without apology, without the smallest indication that he understood this to be a controversial statement rather than a simple declaration of fact. He said it the way you say a thing that has been true for some time and that you are only now finding the right moment to make external. "I intend to marry Lydia." He did not look at Eleanor when he said it. He looked at Lydia, with that expression, the garden one, the one with no performance in it, and waited with the patient certainty of a man who has placed something valuable on a table and is giving the other person the time they need to decide what to do with it. Eleanor drew breath with the precise intake of a woman preparing a response that would be extensive, structured, and delivered at controlled volume. You would compromise this family, she said, each word placed with cold deliberateness. You would dishonor an understanding. You would set aside a woman of impeccable. I would set aside a blueprint, Richard said, and there was something in his voice now, not hardness, not impatience, but the firm, unmoving quality of a man who has spent a very long time being managed and has quietly, permanently, finished with it. I would set aside an arrangement constructed by people who did not consult me and a set of expectations that have never once accounted for what I actually require from a life. He paused. I have been the Duke of Ashford since I was 19 years old. I have fulfilled every obligation placed before me without complaint and without exception. I am asking, for the first time, for one thing that is mine. I am asking for the person who looked at me and saw a man. The salon was very quiet. Celeste, at the window, let out a slow and careful breath. Something in her expression had shifted, the complicated thing had resolved itself, and what remained was not heartbreak after all, but the quiet, slightly wondering look of a woman realizing that she has been spared something she had not known she needed to be spared from. Eleanor stood in the center of the room with the stillness of a woman whose argument has not been defeated but whose ammunition has been, without warning, rendered beside the point. Lydia looked at Richard. "You did not ask me," she said, very quietly. He turned to her fully then, and the room and its occupants fell away from his attention as completely as they always did, as completely as the ballroom had fallen away that first night, until there was nothing in his expression but her. "Lydia," he said, and his voice carried the plain, undecorated weight of a man who has run out of patience for saying things he does not mean. "Will you marry me?" She thought about for years of wanting nothing. She thought about violet dresses and corner seats and the book she had been failing to read since the night he first found her face in the dark. She thought about garden benches and misty mornings and the specific, terrifying warmth of being seen by someone who was not going to stop. "Yes," she said. Simply. Without rehearsal. Without the careful architecture of a woman protecting herself from hope. Just yes. Eleanor Sontillon closed her eyes for precisely 3 seconds. Then she opened them, straightened her already straight spine, and began the rapid, silent restructuring of a narrative that she would, by morning, have reframed into something that had been her idea all along. They married on the 14th of December, when the frost had settled permanently into the ground and the elm trees stood bare and unashamed against a sky the color of pale pewter, and the world had gone quiet in the particular way it goes quiet in winter, not empty, but distilled, stripped of everything unnecessary, left with only what was actually true. There were 19 people in attendance. Eleanor Sontillon had initially proposed a guest list of 140. She had spoken, at some length and with considerable architectural detail, about the social necessity of a ducal wedding being witnessed by the full weight of their circle, about visibility, about statement, about the importance of controlling the narrative by populating it with the right observers. She had presented this case with the focused energy of a woman who understood that if she could not prevent the ending she had not chosen, she could at least stage it in a way that served her purposes. Richard had listened to all of this with the patient, courteous attention he brought to things he had already decided and said, gently and without negotiation, that they would have 19 people and a small church and whatever flowers Lydia wanted, and that the narrative would take care of itself. Lydia had wanted white roses. Simple ones, without arrangement or architecture, just gathered and held. So that is what she carried. The church was 30 minutes from the estate, a small stone building that had been conducting the serious business of marking human occasions for 400 years and had no particular interest in the social mathematics of the ton. It smelled of cold air and candle wax and the specific, ageless quiet of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human feeling over centuries and learned to hold it without judgment. Morning light came through the east window in long, pale slabs and lay across the stone floor like something that had also decided to attend. Celeste stood at Lydia's left shoulder, in a gown the color of deep winter blue, and spent the better part of the ceremony with the quiet, wondering expression of a woman recalibrating something fundamental about how she understood her sister. She had found her own footing in the week since the Harwell ball with a grace that had surprised everyone, including herself, Lord Ashby, a traditional and genuinely warm-natured earl who had been quietly devoted to Celeste for 2 seasons without any of the elaborate social machinery noticing, had made his feelings known in the aftermath of the scandal with the straightforward sincerity of a man who had simply been waiting for the room to stop looking in the wrong direction. Celeste had said yes with the particular relief of a woman discovering that the story she actually wanted had been standing patiently beside the story she had been told to want all along. She caught Lydia's eye before the ceremony began and smiled, not the practiced ballroom smile, not the warm social performance, but the real one, the one Lydia had known since childhood, the one that lived underneath all the golden radiance and meant simply, "I see you." "I am glad." Lydia smiled back. Then she looked forward, and Richard was there. He was watching her come toward him with the expression she had catalogued and returned to so many times over so many sleepless nights that she knew every variation of it by now, but this version was new. This was the garden expression and the ballroom expression, and every unguarded moment between them distilled into one, worn openly in front of 19 witnesses and the pale December light and 400 years of cold stone, with no apology and no restraint and nothing held back for the management of appearances. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night across the crowded ballroom, as though every other thing in the room had ceased to exist, except that tonight there was no crowd to bypass, no golden sister positioned under the chandelier, no elaborate social machinery grinding away at its obligations in the background. Tonight there was only this. The short walk across stone flags. The white roses. The pale light finding her face, not because a chandelier had been angled to produce the effect, but simply because she was there and the morning was there and they had arrived at the same place at the same time without any arrangement at all. She reached him. He took her hand with the same steady, unhurried certainty with which he had held it out to her on the Harwell ballroom floor, the gesture of a man who has made his choice and found that the making of it has produced, in place of the doubt he was perhaps expecting, a very great and very quiet peace. The ceremony was short. The words were old. The 19 people in the pews were still and attentive in the way of people witnessing something that is not performing for them but simply happening, truthfully, in their presence. When it was done, Lydia stood in the pale December light with her white roses and her husband's hand and the extraordinary, unfamiliar, slightly overwhelming sensation of being exactly where she was without apology, not at the edge of the room, not in the shadow beyond the chandelier's reach, not behind the careful wall of a book held between herself and the risk of wanting something. At the center. Still. Quiet. Entirely, completely, irreversibly herself. She had spent for years learning to disappear. She had worn the violet dress and chosen the darkest corner and built, brick by careful brick, a life that asked nothing of the world because she had decided the world would give her nothing worth the asking. She had been so thoroughly, so painstakingly, so unnecessarily wrong. Richard leaned close and said something that was only for her, low and unhurried in the way of a man who has stopped performing for rooms and is speaking now to one person only, the one person who had ever required him to be nothing more and nothing less than exactly what he was. Lydia laughed, not the practiced kind, not the socially calibrated kind, but the real kind, the kind that happens to a person rather than being produced by them, and the sound of it rose into the cold vaulted space above them and stayed there, bright and uncontained, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be let out. Outside, the frost held the ground and the elm tree stood bare and the winter sky stretched pale and enormous over everything, over the small stone church and the 19 people inside it and the 2 people at the front of it who had found each other, improbably and inconveniently and without the assistance of any blueprint, in the shadows at the edge of a room where no one had thought to look. The girl nobody had wanted had become the woman somebody had risked everything to choose. And she had finally, after 4 long years of practiced invisibility, stepped out of the shadows and into the plain, undecorated, extraordinary light of being fully seen.